Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Good evening, everyone. My name is Natasha Zawadzka. I'm in charge of cultural events at Alliance Française of Washington, D.C. And here with us, we also have Executive Director of Alliance Française, Sarah De La Genti. And we are thrilled to have Professor Rhonda Garelick joining us tonight to talk about the most iconic French fashion designer, Coco Chanel. So now let me introduce Professor Rhonda Garelick to all of you. So Rhonda Garelick is Dean of the School of Art and Design History and Theory at Parsons School of Design in New York, where she's also Professor of Fashion and Design Studies. She holds a PhD, Masters of Philosophy, and Bachelor in French and Comparative Literature from Yale University. She's the author of 3 books, and she writes on fashion and cultural politics for New York Magazine, The New York Times, and many other publications. And today we're going to talk about her New York Times bestselling biography of Coco Chanel, which is called Mademoiselle, Coco Chanel and the Pulse of History. Professor Garelick, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you to the Alliance Française of Washington for this nice invitation. Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be virtually with all of you this evening, and thank you for being interested as the world continues to be in the iconic Coco Chanel. Natasha, you invited me to read just a few brief passages from the book before we begin our question and answer discussion. Shall I do that now?
Of course, yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, so I thought I would read just a little bit from the introduction to the book, in which I try to set the scene, and I think this will explain a little bit my personal fascination with this figure. Corporate headquarters for the House of Chanel occupies an anonymous building on a cul-de-sac in Paris's fashionable first arrondissement. Stepping inside the lobby, one enters a high modernist temple, a hushed, windowless cavern of gleaming cream-colored marble, smoked glass doors, and Eames chairs for waiting guests. Patience is required here, since even after being announced by security guards, all visitors are personally ushered upstairs by a Chanel employee who must penetrate an elaborate series of high-security checkpoints with an electronic badge. These badges are worn on elastic strings around the neck, often hidden beneath the long ropes of Chanel pearls worn by so many of the mostly female employees here, along with chain link belts, boucle suits, jersey separates, quilted purses, beige and black shoes, and hundreds of other iconic objects, which together with the wafting clouds of Chanel No. 5, conjure the goddess who haunts this temple still. She may have passed away more than 40 years ago at the age of 87, but within these marble walls, the founder of this empire is ever young, ever present, and referred to simply as Mademoiselle. Ask nearly any woman in the developed world if she is familiar with Chanel, and you get an instant reaction, a little whoosh of breath, a deep awareness. Most men know who she is too, or rather what it is, since part of what is being recognized is an identity that transcends fashion and even transcends the person herself. For 100 years and counting, Gabrielle Coco Chanel has exerted global influence as a designer, a businesswoman, a corporate brand, and finally, as a symbol of feminine privilege and style.
Thank you very much. And actually, before even letting everyone in, while we were still in the waiting room, me, Professor Garelick, and Sarah De La Genti noticed that we are all wearing black, we're wearing glasses, and some of them are wearing costume jewelry. This is the direct influence of Coco Chanel, n'est-ce pas? Is that true? Right, okay, let's start. And so during her life, Gabrielle, that was her real name, Coco Chanel, was very averse to the idea of having a biography written for her. And in the scarce interviews obtained, she would openly lie, she would make up things and wouldn't even bother being consistent with all the fantasies and fictions she created. She, at some point, you mentioned even that she thought of the idea of making a biography written for her illegal. Anyways, after her death, a lot of biographies are written and many people dared write it, and you as well. So my first question is, what prompted you to write your book?
Lunacy, maybe. But seriously, when I began this project, there were, I believe, 77 extant biographies of Coco Chanel already there in different languages. And I actually wasn't planning to write a traditional biography at all. My original plan was to write a book about Chanel as a costume designer, because what most people probably still don't know very well, and certainly didn't back then, is that Chanel had a 30-year career as a designer for the stage, for the ballet, for cinema in several countries, and she was very successful at it. And I was fascinated by this aspect of her work. So I began a book about her costume career. And as I was researching that, it struck me very dramatically that, yes, of course, she was an important costume designer, but that the drama she was costuming went far beyond any stage. The stage she was costuming was us, all of us globally, much of the world's women, and that the character she was costuming was in some sense her created self. And so, as you point out, so many of us online right now are wearing remnants of her influence. She has continued for 100 years to impress this style on us. And so I still think of it as a book about theater, but about theater on the most massive scale imaginable. And I did not see that anyone had really looked at her life that way.
Yes, that's very interesting what you mentioned about her being a costume designer, how it attracted your attention first, and how she basically wanted to dress the whole world, and in which she basically succeeded. Like as you say in your book, look around you and you will see women wearing flat shoes, t-shirts, skirt suits, swimming suits, even basic things like having your hair cut short, right? And glasses as a fashion statement, not being embarrassed doing that, right? Costume jewelry, just to name a few. That's quite incredible.
It is indeed.
Okay.
Not being ashamed of your eyeglasses. For all of us right now, and I see a number of those I can see on the screen, are wearing our glasses. It was thanks to Chanel that we don't feel embarrassed by our myopia.
Right. Okay, so let's sort of start from the very beginning. In your book, you talk a lot about her childhood, as much as she tried to obscure it and sort of cover it up and make other stories. And yet she was born in poverty. She was an orphan. I mean, at some point, her mom died when she was young, and her dad basically abandoned her and her sisters, and she ended up in an orphanage housed by the Aubezine Abbey. And let me share my screen here so that you can see it. Here you are. Voila. So that's where she basically spent her teenage years from age 12 to 18. And so tell us a little more about that part of your life, and how do you think that affected the exposure to such strict regimen and the Catholic religion affected her future life and her work, basically?
Yes, there's so much to say about that. As you can see from this photograph of Aubezine, it was a beautiful but very imposing and dark place without a lot of windows. Chanel and her two sisters were sent there within days of their mother's death. Their mother died a very miserable, probably tubercular death. Their father was rarely around, and he came back upon his wife's death and took the girls in a wagon to the door of this abbey and basically deposited them and never returned. So they lost one parent to a terrible death, and they gradually realized that the father who'd promised to come back was never going to come back. So I think in addition to the austerity of a convent orphanage, we have to think about the trauma of abandonment that put them there in the first place. So I think those two things were the primary forces that marked her early life. Within the convent orphanage, though, I think it's very interesting to consider that, first of all, she absorbed a lot of the great beauty of the place, the beauty of ritual, the beauty of the Catholic Mass, the beauty of the priests and the nuns' garb. She was definitely influenced by the aesthetic of the architecture, and even more important, I think, the power structure, if you could call it that, of a 19th century convent, which is to say, this was a place entirely run by women. These were women who were not married. These were women who had education, who could read and write, who ran an organization, of kind of business, and they were in charge. And had she grown up like all other rural peasant girls of 19th century France, she would never have seen any kind of organizational structure with women in charge. And so even though I think it was traumatic in many ways, it was a source of aesthetic beauty and of inspiration. And it was clear that she had an attachment to those nuns because she did stay in touch with a few of them later in her life, although surreptitiously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting what you say, that nuns basically, in strike difference to the rest of the world, represented independent women. But also later in your book, you say that Chanel's clothes were meant to represent a sexual armor, sort of a sexual protection, and they were meant to be modest, right? Her clothes are never super revealing or anything like that. Do you think her life in the Abbey sort of affected the style?
It's a very interesting question, Natasha. I do refer to her clothing as a kind of sexual armor, and I think there are several levels to that. What I mean by that, first of all, is that Chanel's style was modest. She never revealed bosom. She didn't think women should show too much leg or thigh. While they were slim-fitting clothes, they were never overtly sexualizing. Of course, she grew up at a young age. She was in a very Catholic and therefore extremely conservative, sexually extremely conservative environment. But I think also what happened just after her youth in the orphanage must be considered as well. She spent several years when she was released, at 18, the girls had to leave, and she lived as a seamstress in a small town. She was repairing uniforms for soldiers. She was trying to become a singer. She had a stint as what they called a water girl in Deauville, where she sold mineral water. But these were very exposing venues, very vulnerable places for a young girl with no family, no money, no support system. And frankly, there is suggestion, and I can only just say that much because I don't have hard documentation, that she may have made her living the way maybe other very pretty teenage girls with no means made their living, if you see what I mean. So I imagine that she was exposed to difficulties in a sexual way. And judging from things she said later in her life, I think she thought it very important that young women protect themselves, that they are modest in a way. Even though she had quite an adventurous romantic life, she had an interest in personal self-containment, and you see that in the clothing.
Right, that's very interesting. Yes, and so here I took the liberty of including this slide, which is not from your book, and you're not talking about that, but I just came across that a couple of days ago, and this is actually Spring Summer 2020 Chanel's collection by the creative director Virginie Viard. And this is not in the Aubezine, but she was trying to recreate the ambiance and sort of bring us back to her origins and to the simplicity and modesty of her style. That's why I included it here.
Well, I love seeing that. And I think it's interesting that even now with what is the third director of the Maison Chanel, Virginie Viard, we see this constant return to the biography of Chanel as part of the aesthetic of the house. It's not just a style of clothing, it's a style, it's a mythology around the creator where they return to the story of her childhood, of places that she loved. The recreation of that mythology is ever present in the House of Chanel, which I think is unique.
Absolutely. Okay, and now, if you allow, let me read a very short passage from your book, and that will be my next question, actually. Nothing telegraphs wealth and stature like a coat with a fur collar. But make that coat out of common jersey and the fur coat out of cheap and lowly rabbit, and you've undermined the implied value of the coat. Now, sell it at an exorbitant price, as if the coat were made of imported silk trimmed with sable, and you've arrived at the core of Chanel's business model, the essence of the style that Paul Poiret dubbed luxurious poverty. The clothes were humble, but conveyed, inversely, an aura of status. Chanel is master of her art, and her art resides in Jersey, declared Vogue. Chanel had found a way to charge duchesses a fortune for the privilege of dressing in materials worn by their servants, the ultimate revenge of this Necesitous, this once needy girl from the provincial orphanage. There's a lot here, but I really like this expression, luxurious poverty. And I think that really describes so well Coco Chanel's style and even her business plan, right? So maybe can you tell us a little more about how did she manage to convince all these aristocratic women, sophisticated women, to basically dress in jersey, basically dress in poor men's fabrics?
It's in some ways the greatest revenge story of fashion history. And luxurious poverty, that phrase coined by Paul Poiret, was intended as an insult. It's, or what we call a left-handed compliment, right? But it turns out to be a fabulous success story, as you point out. So when Chanel started her career, she didn't have any money. And one of the first things she did was buy up many bolts of jersey from Rodier, and make them into tube dresses and skirts. It's the simplest kind of sewing in the world. And as you know, jersey, you can't really do that much with jersey because it puckers and it bends. You basically create a cylinder. And she then charged the equivalent of thousands and thousands of dollars for little shirts and little tube skirts, which were made not only of jersey, but let it be remembered that jersey was such a lowly fabric. It was only used at that time for men's underwear. So she was convincing women who would have worn a Poiret, or earlier than Poiret, like a Worth dress of silk and tulle and feathers and hats and corsets and fur bellows of all sorts. She convinced those same people to pay just as much as they would for a gown of that nature for the equivalent of a tube made of their husband's underwear material. And to understand this kind of genius and revenge strategy, we do need to go back to when she was, and you referred to this term, a Necesitous. The term comes from the orphanage, actually the second one that she lived in. Aubezine was the first, and then she moved into a second facility where the girls were separated by their financial status. There were two kinds of child in this orphanage. Those who had a little bit of family support, and those who were utterly destitute, who were completely without family or money, and they were on the charity of the state. Those girls were called the needy girls, and they had to serve the other children. They had to sit in a separate area. And key for all of what we're discussing, they had to wear a special uniform. And that uniform was, and you probably all can guess this, a simple black frock, a little black dress. When Chanel grew older and developed her style, she took tremendous pleasure in putting these aristocrats and women of great wealth in essentially the costumes she'd been forced to wear as a Necesitous. So it was a reversal and a projection. But at the same time, we're talking about the era around World War I, when there was a new kind of social mobility for many women. And materials were scarce. And so Chanel's aesthetic of physical relative liberty compared to the encumbrances of earlier clothes, plus the fact that it could be made easily out of available materials, made it really attractive. And the final component, if I may just add one more thing, is Chanel herself, because she was slim, she was athletic, she was pretty in an unconventional way for the time. And when she wore these clothes, she looked uniquely alluring in a way that struck women at the time as modern. And she had a charisma that made people somehow, and this is very powerful and almost hard to describe, she had a force field around her that made people want to copy her. And it wasn't just sartorial, it was about personality. So all these things together created what we still see as an aesthetic of a sort of sleek, easy, and easily reproducible at all price points look.
Right. Well, we'll come back to the fact of being copied and her will to be copied. But so let me just show here, explain what you see here on this slide. So on the left, you see sort of a usual fashion of the day, the beginning of the 20th century, an afternoon dress by the designer Worth, right? And that's what Chanel really did not like, what List pretended that she did not like. And on the right, you see herself in her own clothes, if I'm not mistaken, that jersey, right? Very comfortable, stretchy, her own sportswear, a little late in 1916. And
athletic. She's playing golf.
right. And so that, I think that was part of her conflicting personality, right? As much as throughout the book, you can feel it that she worshipped aristocracy. She badly wanted to be part of it. And at the same time, she rejected their style and she made them wear what she wanted.
Yes, I mean, Chanel's love for the aristocracy was in part a function of just how deracinated she felt. It wasn't just that she was from a very poor background. It was that she had no roots, or she felt she didn't. She was deprived of her parents. She was separated from her brothers. There were also Chanel brothers who were sent off to work as farmhands. And she quickly figured out, largely at the beginning through reading romance novels, that happiness, or this was her fantasy, would lie in acceding to royalty or the aristocracy and having someone sweep her away to a life of ease and luxury. Of course, she didn't have that, so she created a kind of alternative and managed to use it to get herself access to that social class. This is a great photo. This is Chanel with her first great love, Arthur Capel, who was also called Boy Capel, who was a French-British diplomat and coal mogul from whom she cadged sportswear. She started really loving men's sportswear, and she would borrow his and other gentlemen's tennis clothes, riding clothes, and then gradually adapted them for women. She was athletic, they fit her figure, but it was also a way of inserting herself into that life. She was a natural athlete, and she learned to ride, and she learned to play tennis very well, and she fit in. She was a little bit of a tomboy.
Reading your book, it's fascinating to see Coco Chanel grow from a simple seamstress to, at some point, a saleswoman who would give her hats sort of away for publicity, and then basically to a powerful style icon everybody wants to imitate. And to quote you in the book, Coco Chanel's life became a movie for the world to watch with costumes to wear. And that made me think about our world with the social media, with Instagram and Facebook, and how we can basically literally follow lives of our favorite celebrities and designers and be part of it. She did not have any of that. So I guess you really need to read the book to totally grasp her story, right? But maybe can you tell us in a couple of words how she started with her business and how did she advance so quickly?
Well, she didn't have social media, but she did have a kind of business genius that rivals Zuckerberg, honestly. What she figured out early on is that if she created a look and she could convince some of her fashionable, wealthy women friends to wear that look at galas, at parties, at dinners, that she would gather word of mouth fame. And she selected very carefully the women she surrounded herself with. And she had a kind of harem of very attractive socialites. And she would dress them. Often she would give them clothes for free. And they understood that they should wear them. And they wanted to wear them to their various social occasions. And people started asking who had designed them. She started with hats. And she sort of worked her way down. She also had a knack for taking things, elements of style from all around her, so that the people who were dressing in her clothes never felt that they were copying entirely so much as they were being enhanced in their own best look. It was a very subtle understanding she had of how to deal with people, which is a natural saleswoman's talent. Her father, who was around intermittently in her early life, was a peddler. And he had been known to be an extremely successful peddler with the ladies. He would take his cart with his wares to different little towns around France, and he would sweet talk people into buying all kinds of strange little objects. And I do think that she inherited her father's knack for patter and salesmanship. She also didn't have social media, but she had the press. And as she got a little bit older, she started making quite canny use of society journalism. She would make sure she or her friends were being photographed in the society columns at various events, and that's how she got word of mouth.
Yeah, so speaking of taking elements from other people and incorporating it in her own styles, basically, right, that Coco Chanel met a lot of very influential, high-ranking people with very different cultural backgrounds. men of arts, music, culture, royalty, diplomacy. And again, to quote your book, she wouldn't just come in contact with them, she would swallow whole and incorporate whatever appeared most delicious in them. That tells a lot about her. And also, that's what I love about your book. You go so much far beyond just fashion. And later in your book, you say that what we are wearing now is Chanel's distillation of European history. And you do tell by telling the story of Chanel, inevitably the history of Europe in between two wars. And so just to name a few, Coco Chanel met Picasso, Salvador Dali, Churchill, Diaghilev, Stravinsky, Charlie Chaplin, really just to name a few. And obviously we can't talk about them all, but I can't help asking this question. I'm Russian. So can you tell us more about her period of her life when she was in a relationship with Grand Duke Dmitry Romanov, who was the surviving, I mean, he escaped the execution. That's a whole totally different, fascinating story, but we don't have time for that. Right. But so he was the first cousin of the last Tsar of the Imperial Russia, Nikolai II, and he went into exile. And they met and they had a love affair, as far as I know. And so obviously he inspired her and he influenced her life and her style. So can you maybe talk a little more about that?
Yes, it fascinates me as well, Natasha. I come too from a Russian family, and Dmitry was younger than Chanel, and he was, as you say, in exile in Paris. And I will say briefly, because it's just too good not to mention, he'd been involved in the murder of Rasputin, which is partly why he was on the lam in Paris. But he was also, like many of the exiled members of the family and also monarchists of Russia, he was very invested in a restoration of the Russian empire. He was part of a circle in Europe of exiles who were trying to bring back a czar and overturn the Russian Revolution. So Chanel got drawn into that world in the early 1920s. And at the same time, as you say, he was a profound style influence on her, but not just Dmitry. Dmitry's circle, and particularly his sister, Princess Marie, because she was a very fine embroiderer and jacquard creator. And it was through Marie and Dmitry that Chanel began her inspired Russian looks of 1922. And you can see a number of them here. The middle design shows you the classic Russian cross. The coat on the left was a winter coat of jacquard that was partially designed with Princess Marie, that later also wound up a costume in one of Jean Cocteau's plays. The Dmitry connection also brought her into contact with very, very lavish jewelry. Dmitry had still a number of Russian imperial jewels in his possession, including, yes, Romanov pearls. And this is Chanel wearing her famous ropes of pearls. Now, what happened was Dmitry gave her as a precious gift his remaining strand of Romanov pearls as a very important token. And she took them and immediately had them copied and pasted and wore the real precious Romanov pearls amid the strings of cheap, I'm wearing copies myself of pearls just in her honor today. She wore them mixed up with all the fake jewelry she immediately had made. And she would wear them over a black sweater and go to the cinema like that. And he was, horrified that anyone could debase his family tradition like this. But of course, it created the beginning of her costume jewelry empire. And it began with Dmitry. I actually had Dmitry's private diaries unlocked for the first time. They have been kept in Harvard's Houghton Library, and I had them unlocked and translated by a marvelous Harvard Russian scholar. And it was from those diaries that I was able to glean more about their relationship, but also Dmitry's influence on her aesthetically. I found doodles in the pages that I'm pretty sure look like the early incarnations of her perfume box and bottle, which were also created at the time she was involved with Dmitry through the perfumer he introduced her to, who was Ernst Beau, who'd been perfumer to the Tsar.
That's right. And so I didn't include his sketch, but it's my understanding that was during that period of her time that she created her logo, right? And also in your book, you say how that was unspeakable for a designer, well, to be a designer to start with, but also to have a logo. So maybe you can tell us a couple words about what it may mean, the two C's, and also just the mere fact of introducing a logo.
Yeah, she created this logo during her time with Dmitry, and the idea of wearing someone else's initials was, as you say, it was unheard of at the time. Designers were not considered artists to be proud of wearing. They were servants, tradespeople. It would have been like wearing your plumber's initials on your gown. That it was unthinkable. But Chanel figured out that she could create her imprimatur in a way that itself had an almost talismanic power. And I do think that her time with Dmitry introduced her to certain kinds of mysticism, and she became interested in that. Boy Capel was also very interested in mysticism. And it has been pointed out, I cannot say that I agree with this or don't agree with this, but the Maison Chanel believes that the two C's are actually her fantasized marriage of herself with Capel, with whom she'd had a rupture, who married someone else, and that the C and the C represent Chanel and Capel, and it was sort of a fantasy marriage in her head. I cannot say that's the case. I actually think that it was her desire, again, to imprint her identity on others, much as she did her style. And as you know, it's taken on a life of its own. Many other designer logos copied this motif. And I will say, and perhaps you are thinking this, when she was spending time with Dmitry in these royalist circles, there was also a profound fascistic component to it. It was really the beginning of early fascism in certain places that they were traveling to. And it was within a year of when the Germans adopted the swastika as their logo that Chanel came up with this logo. And she was definitely traveling in those circles. And I have asked myself many times if she was sort of consciously or unconsciously finding the power of a certain kind of visual motif to crystallize mythology, and it led her to this powerful visual.
Oh, yeah. And since you mentioned that, I guess I'll ask it straight away here. So in your book, you draw very interesting similarities between fascist propaganda and Chanel branding. I thought that was very interesting. So many considered fascist uniforms to be beautiful. And at the time, for some people, that was almost an incentive to join it. And in a way, to join this elite club. And in a way, Chanel was also creating a world, an elite club only chosen people can belong to. And in which Chanel strove to be the dictator of crowds, as you, I think, say in your book. So can you tell us more about the similarities?
Yes. I asked myself when I started working on this biography, the question I was really trying to answer is, how did this happen? How did one person, one woman, acquire and sustain, even long past her death, the level of aesthetic influence she has? And the answer cannot simply be, oh, she was a very good designer. She was a good designer, but frankly, there are many better designers. The answer to me had to lie in some other power that she had, or something she was tapping into in people historically. And when I began reading about her associations with a certain right-wing, let's call it proto-fascistic element in Europe, and their fascination with origin stories, mythologies, the Übermensch, athleticism, a certain kind of sleek beauty of bearing, of physicality, I began seeing a correlation. I want to be very, very clear. I am not saying that to wear Chanel is to be a Nazi, or that she herself was a Nazi. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the aesthetic of the Nazi party, especially Nazi officer uniforms and their ideology of a kind of ancient world of superior beings who were strong and independent and athletic, largely it's a male-centric story, that Chanel kind of intuited the attraction of that and created a kind of corollary for women, athletic, sleek, powerful, free, that I think resonated at the time with the same kind of yearnings, longings, needs that fascism tapped into. And so I don't think it's accidental that she was drawn to that world, nor do I think it accidental that during the interwar period in Europe, her fame and her style skyrocketed as this new form of political ideology was also spreading. And I do think that there is a comparison to be made between her work and fascist aesthetics, for example.
Yes. Okay, I'll come back to her involvement with the fascists a couple of seconds later, but let's not skip that part of her career.
Mhm.
And so, can you tell us more about this important step she made to tap into perfume and basically introducing something which still remains to be the most famous, the most successful perfume in the world, Chanel Numéro 5?
Numéro 5 is the reason she became one of the richest women in the world. And it is the reason why the Chanel Corporation is, I think it's estimated to be a $10 billion private corporation. Chanel decided when she was with Dmitry that a perfume would be a wonderful linchpin for her work. And she started working with the gentleman I mentioned earlier, Ernst Beau. And it turns out that she had a great nose. And she remembered scents from her childhood, and she could distinguish many different flowers and grasses and oils. She was a natural, actually, which doesn't surprise me when I think about how she was almost like a finely tuned wild animal in the forest. She was always sort of, all her senses were alive to any possible alterations in her environment. She was highly, highly sensitive, sensorially sensitive. So it's not surprising that this would appeal to her. She also had this sense that she wanted to create the first scientific modern perfume. At the time, of course, there were many, many perfumes, and they all tended to be very floral. They had very romantic literary names like Knights of Scheherazade or, Oriental Passion, sort of overblown melodramatic names like that. And she decided that she would break with that, much the same way she had aesthetically with her dresses. She was going to have sleek, simple scents, and she created with Beau a very clean, wintry smell that had a note of synthetic aldehydes in it. It was the first perfume to be so dependent on aldehydes, although it also used flowers. She also wanted to have the most expensive flowers in the world. So she wanted something clean, crisp, modern, scientific, but she also wanted something lavish and floral and expensive. That was a typical sort of contradiction for her. And they arrived at the preferred formulation, which in the lore of the house is the fifth permutation that the perfumer created for her. I don't know if that's actually why it's called number 5. I have my own theories about why. The bottle was equally important. Bottles of perfume were, fantastical crystal affairs, but she wanted a high modernist bottle. And that's what she came up with. And I also saw drawings that look like that in Dmitry's notebooks. And finally, it was also the first place that she used her CC logos. On the top of the stopper was the famous interlocking C's. So she was creating a desirable object in addition to a scent. And in keeping with her usual policies, she figured out that the way to sell it was to spray it in the air in a restaurant and have people just walk through the cloud and then start to say, wait, what was that? And she let it waft over many society ladies who then just fell in love with it.
Right. It's interesting because the next week we are having a perfume workshop, a 2-hour workshop about the world of perfume. I would love to have Chanel run it, but I'm sure we'll have a lot of fun next week discovering that. So my next question is sort of about this conundrum. On the one hand, Coco Chanel really wanted to be the style icon, to be copied by as many people as possible, to be in the most possible center of attention, to be venerated even. But at the same time, and as much as it is conflicting with her first desire, is that she wanted to remain in obscurity. And to quote your book, meticulously effacing her true self. And here to represent that, you see a cartoon sketch of Coco Chanel by Jean Cocteau, and you see that there's no face, but you can guess that it's Coco Chanel. So do you think she was happy? Do you think how these two things could reconcile in one person?
Well, She definitely wanted to be the center of a universe of her own creation, and she said as much directly. And she managed that in her empire that she built. But you're right, she absolutely did not want the truth of her early life, especially, to be known. And she spent a lot of time and energy fabricating stories about her early life and paying people from her past to keep quiet about their relationship or her actual childhood. She gave her brothers a fortune just to keep quiet and never come to Paris or alert the media to their existence. She apparently paid nuns at her convent to destroy any correspondence. So yes, she wanted complete obscurity of a certain kind of fact, but she did not want obscurity for herself. What she wanted was to be a kind of theater director of her own personal play about the character she created, this alternative person who was Coco, who was fabulous, who was glamorous, who had lovers, who was rich and beautiful and free and successful. And I think it was exhausting for her. And I think just even keeping that many lies straight was exhausting. So I don't think anyone could say that this was a happy individual. But I will say that I think the question is problematic because I think we tend to ask that about women more than we do men of great success and genius. It's not that I think she was particularly well-adjusted or even pleasant much of the time, but I think that people who are so exceptional, who have this will to create and who have this kind of genius are probably almost always unhappy, uncomfortable. They have to be uncomfortable in order to create. So I think the obscurity that she embraced was really very deep inside herself. But for the world, she wanted utter visibility to the very last moment. And she had it. She really did.
Right. Okay, so we're now approaching the 30s, and I have a couple of questions here in the fascist years and the nationalist sort of sentiment circulating in aristocracy in France. And so in your book, you point out how almost no one has truly tapped into Chanel's relationship with politics. And when museum director even told you that if you mention Chanel in politics, they will shut you down. So how hard was it to actually do this research? Because you do write a lot about that period of her life and her involvement with the Nazi regime or nationalist ideas. So how hard was to do this research and to obtain information?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, it was hard to do any kind of research on Coco Chanel because the first place I went was the archives of the Maison Chanel, which is a very professionally kept archives with professional archivists working there. However, getting in is next to impossible. And I spent fully 2 years knocking on that door, sending letters, having people intervene on my behalf. And it was very clear they did not want researchers in. So, and that was not about Nazism that was just any kind of access to their archives was extremely difficult. I finally got in. That's a whole other story I would tell you another time. When it came to researching this sort of darker period of her life, I could not rely on any obvious sources because there was so much fabrication and so much deliberate hiding. So I did my own sort of sleuth work, and I found myself in places like the Paris police archives, where there are extensive documents that go back long before World War II, actually date to before World War I, of surveillance by the French police of Chanel's comings and goings to Germany, her friendships, and so although things are misspelled and things are hard to understand, and it's all handwritten and faded, so I did a lot of legwork. I also found that going through other people in her life, people she was close to, and tracking down archives around her was very productive. So this is sort of the work of the historian. For example, at the London Imperial War College, I found the documents, the correspondence of her lover, Boy Capel, at the time of their relationship. He had been a kind of backstage unofficial diplomat during World War I, and he was working for the French and British governments with Lloyd George and Clemenceau. And there were letters back and forth between him and his commander, plans they were making, and occasionally there would be mention of his girlfriend. And what I started to see were attachments and policies that she would have been exposed to that no one had ever really put together with her actual aesthetics. That was considered her love life, but she was smack in the middle of backstage war maneuverings. I also interviewed obscure people. I met a countess in Genoa who had known Chanel when she was a very young girl, who had very interesting ideas, having herself known Walter Schellenberg, and her family had been a Nazi family at the time. She told me things that I couldn't have found elsewhere. So I went on a long kind of detective hunt, and it was challenging, absolutely.
But you did find a lot, something I've never even known about her. In your book, you're talking that she was basically even a spy. Maybe that's too much of a word, but she did even have a code name, right? And she was working for the Germans.
Yes.
And she was even involved with this German officer stationed in Paris at the time. So I don't know if you want to mention a couple of words about that. And my bigger question here is, even though she was accused of treachery, but sort of acquitted, right? And she went into self-imposed exile to Switzerland, but then she came back and she was sort of welcomed back again. People were looking forward to seeing her new collections. Vogue was talking about her. Why do you think France forgave her so quickly?
Well, a couple of things. She did go into exile and she was interrogated after the war very briefly and allowed to go free. That's true. And she did go into self-imposed exile, also true. But it wasn't so simple, and it is likely that she was allowed to leave the country under the protection of Winston Churchill. And there is reason to believe that Winston Churchill felt it was best for Coco Chanel to be quietly out of the country because she'd been very close with members of the British royal family during the war, including Edward, who were actually themselves also German sympathizers. This is famously known. And so I think Churchill, who had befriended her, Churchill was quite fond of Chanel. He likely helped get her out of the country with no repercussions. When she returned, so she was in exile for 12 years, nearly 12 years, in Switzerland. When she returned, and there she is in Switzerland with her German officer lover, the Baron von Dinklage, who was known as Spatz. When she came back, she was actually not immediately embraced or forgiven by the French. It was a little bit harder than that. She had her first collection, so that was in 1955. It was not well reviewed. People said, this is boring, she looks tired. Her clothes were very much the clothes, the style that she had left Paris doing all those years ago. What happened, and I think this is so interesting, is that the Americans got hold of her. And the Americans, especially Carmel Snow of Harper's Bazaar, the very famous editor, they said, wow, this stuff is so American. It really feels like our kind of look. This is fresh and athletic and modern. And the Americans thought what the French had found tired and dull was new and fresh. And that's because, newness and freshness are completely subjective, and America was flush with its post-war victory, and women were looking for simpler styles. That we had the Dior look, we had the giant skirts of Jacques Fath and Dior, and this was a return to something that felt very right to America. And as soon as the Americans embraced Chanel's return, then the French said, welcome back, Coco, we love you again. So it's a kind of amnesia that passed through what I think is the most amnesiac country in the world, and that's us here in the US. That my theory is like it's a contagion of amnesia. And it's also, frankly, it's money too, because it was clear that it was selling, and if it's successful, then people want it.
Right. I have a couple more questions here, but let me take this question from the chat. I think almost two people asked pretty much the same one. I think it's a very good one. Can you talk a little more about her relationship and communication with other designers of her own time?
She was extremely rivalrous and jealous and possessive of her work. So yes, she obviously knew other designers. She often angered and enraged them, For example, she refused to join the Chamber of Commerce for Fashion in Paris, the syndicat. She did not want to obey their rules. So when the fashion industry wanted to protect the rights to designs, which was a huge problem for many designers. People were copying and stealing. There was plagiarism. And they signed a pact that they would together protect copyright of designs. Chanel refused to join, refused to sign because she liked copying. And she would actually invite seamstresses to her runway collections and have them bring sketch artists to draw. She was openly giving it away, and she enraged her colleagues like Lucien Lelong and others. So there was a rivalrous feeling that she was not playing by the rules. There were one of her closest competitors was Elsa Schiaparelli, of course, who came to prominence during the 30s and before. And Chanel was very threatened by Elsa Schiaparelli, who was in fact, in many ways, the opposite of Chanel. Schiap was wild and experimental and colorful, and she was also working with Jean Cocteau, right? They famously created some wonderful fashions together, and Chanel was very threatened by this. Cocteau was her personal good friend, and she started referring to Schiaparelli as that Italian woman. She wanted nothing to do with her. The one person that she revered and thought was a genius was Balenciaga, who was much younger, but she recognized his talent and said that one, you know, he is worthy of the mantle.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll keep my one last question for later, but I think Sarah got some questions directly to her. Maybe you want to ask one, Sarah?
Yes, I've got, it's from Melanie. She has quite a few questions, so I'm going to group everything because they're more or less on the same topic. One was actually a first question from Melanie was about the fact that the jersey were non-sustainable, and how you know, is it possible to redefine what is fashion and fabrics that are sustainable, simple lines? But then there was a series of questions from Melanie here. Let me read that out loud. Why would Coco Chanel want to hide her humble origins? Was it a strict stratification of social class? Melanie says that she recalls Edith Bowling Galt, the second wife of Woodrow Wilson, was snubbed by the aristocratic women until they found out she had royal blood and was actually a direct descent of Pocahontas. Then she also asked who maintains Coco Chanel archives and how do they strictly clean the information about Chanel? Why would she pay the nuns to burn her correspondence? Why was she interested in fascism? And was all the wealthy like that? And did she identify with the wealthy? So I grouped all of Melanie's question in one big question.
Oh, okay. That's a lot of questions. Let me see. Sustainability was not something that Chanel at the time was interested in, although now, of course, it is paramount. The embarrassment of her humble origins was, I think, twofold. Yes, it was because the world was a much more rigid, hierarchical place at the time, and Chanel was not wrong that she was being discriminated against because of her background. For example, she had a number of serious love affairs with men of high social class, and none of them married her. And there was no even conception they would have of marrying her, even though they loved her. And she was painfully aware of this. It happened again and again that she was involved with men whom she thought she would marry or expected something more from. And then they went off to marry somebody else of their own social class, because marriage, remember, was an economic, social partnership. It was a contract. It had nothing to do with romance. And in one case, you know, her great love, Boy Capel, he had no intention of breaking with her. He simply couldn't marry her. He married a woman he wasn't all that passionate about. That was what he had to do. And they actually maintained a love affair for a while until he was tragically killed. But it did not compute in that era that you could make a life with a woman like her. So that was part of it. But also, I think she would have had a different relationship to her past had she had a happy family life with two parents growing up in a more normal way. I think the shock of the abandonment and the death and the solitude combined in her mind with the shame. And I will add that she wasn't just from an illiterate peasant background. Her parents were also unmarried when she was born, so she was technically a bastard, which again, for a Catholic in the 19th century, that is a terrible stain. That is the worst possible kind of inherited sin. So she bore all of this very heavily. Forgive me, Sarah, I can't hold on to all of the many parts of that question. Maybe you could help me out.
Yeah, so who maintains the Coco Chanel archives, and how do they strictly clean the information about Chanel, and why would she pay the nuns to burn her correspondence? And finally, what made her interested in fascism? Were all the wealthy interested in fascism, and did she identify with them because of that?
The reason that she asked the nuns to burn her correspondence, we believe, is that it would have revealed that she was an orphan in a convent orphanage, as opposed to a girl raised on an estate by wealthy aunts, which is what she told people that she was. And it's likely also that the reason she wound up at Aubezine in the first place was that her mother, as a young mother of 5 children and quite poor, seems to have been a laundress for this orphanage as she was, caring for her own children and sick with tuberculosis and so forth. It seems as though her mother had a connection to this orphanage and was doing washing for them. And so even that is somehow more excruciating. In answer to the question about how the archives are maintained, the Chanel archives are, they were moved a number of years ago. For most of the time, they were part of the Rue Cambon, the Paris main office corporate headquarters, behind Cambon, not the store, but behind. A few years back, they were moved to Pantin, to a suburb, but they are professionally kept by a woman I believe is still there, whose name is Marika Gentil, who is absolutely astounding, and she has a team of people who work with her. They are as professional as any museum archive. How do they clean the archives? That is another matter. They are not uncandid when you speak with them. I actually love the people who work there, and I worked with them for years, and they made space for me. Once they let me in, they really let me in, and they had a little office area for me, and I would go there and stay for a long time, and I would lunch with them and chat with them, and they shared a lot with me, and they're perfectly aware of the dark side of Coco Chanel, but they also maintain mostly, shall we say, anodyne records about her. I don't know if they actively remove things that they think might be embarrassing, or they simply don't select them. But obviously any historian or scholar is not going to rely on corporate archives for any kind of serious work. They maintain it very, very well, though, and I know that for years, Karl Lagerfeld depended on this team for much of his own, research. He would go into the archives, or rather he would call and he would say, I need this right away. And they would provide him and his team with background, with drawings, with photographs, and so forth.
Thank you. These were very interesting questions. And someone actually asking, did you manage to talk to any of surviving members of the family of Chanel?
I did. I can't say members because there was only one, and she has sadly since passed away, but I did, and this took quite a lot of doing also. I interviewed Madame Gabriella Bruni, who was either Chanel's grandniece or her granddaughter, and not even she knows for sure. But it took me quite a while of trying to get her to see me, and I had a stroke of good luck, or I don't know, I had a divine bolt. I decided I was going to send her, after she ignored me for quite a while, I sent her transatlantically a giant bouquet of white roses at her home in the countryside. And I just sent it without expecting anything, like you would a ship in a bottle. And to my complete astonishment, I got a handwritten letter back saying, how did you know white roses are my favorite flower? You may come to France and speak to me. And I immediately did just that. And I went to her home, and I shouldn't say she's the only family member because her grandchildren were present. So I may well have met the great granddaughter of Chanel. And I talked to this lady, Gabrielle, who was named after her grandmother or great aunt. And that was fascinating.
Wow. Let me read this comment by, and we're running out of time, so by Stacy Robinson. She says, first of all, exceptional overview of your brilliantly written book, Dr. Garelick, and thank you. However, I wonder if anyone was as heartbroken as I was upon reading about her death. Her life was beautifully tragic, and I do find it a bit difficult to reconcile her dark side against the genius of her passion. And here comes my very last question. Tell us more. How was it writing a book about Coco Chanel? You spent so much time in her mental space, right? Yeah. So how did this book affect you? And I guess that will be the last one.
It's a really good question. I think anyone who is a biographer knows that to be a biographer is to essentially rent real estate in your mind and heart to somebody else. And you get this roommate who does not move out, and it takes quite a long time, and it's a little bit like possession, sort of a mystical possession, and I do not say that with pleasure. I started this book because I was fascinated, and I remain fascinated, but this is not a person who would have been my great friend, and she had a very dark side. She could be quite vicious, quite dangerous. There are other things I learned about her through different channels that were very troubling. And it changed me insofar as I have a serious respect for the power of fashion now and its deeply political nature. My work is largely now about the political gravitas of many things, not just fashion, but many things of women's material culture that are often dismissed or treated as trivial or fun or merely decorative. And I have a sobering understanding of how powerful these things are, and I want to write about that, not just as a kind of feminist liberation of the topic, but because I firmly believe that our shunting aside of these things can lead to political disaster. I truly think there's a fascistic impulse in taking it too lightly. And so that's what I'm dedicated to. And writing this book really led me to that.
Thank you so much, Professor Garelick. Thank you all for being with us tonight. And I guess if you do have more questions, the answers are all here. And really encourage you to read the book. It's a fascinating read. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all for coming. It's a pleasure.